A warm welcome to the FUBiS Digital Lecture Series. My name is Kim Feser. I will introduce my regular FUBiS subject course, Berlin and the Digital Music Era. After a brief introduction, I will give a lecture on one of the course's key topics. I have been teaching this course at FUBiS since 2018. Many students from all over the world have taken part. In my view, the international exchange of perspectives is one of the biggest advantages of the FUBiS program. This is especially true for a topic like Berlin and the Digital Music Era, which deals with the relationship between global developments and local conditions. Therefore, I am always pleased when there is a lively exchange between the participants in the course, from which I myself benefit again and again. I am a philosopher, sociologist, and musicologist. In Berlin, I teach not only at Freie Universität, but also at the University of the Arts. I've given lectures in Tokyo, Beijing, Beirut, and Stanford, among other places. The focus of my research and teaching is on electronic and new music. I am particularly interested in the relationship between aesthetic, technological, and social aspects. Among other things, I am co-editor of the German book Techno Studies about the aesthetics and history of electronic dance music. If you are currently watching this video on the FUBiS website or on YouTube, you will also find the link to the FUBiS film, which gives you a good impression of the regular on-campus FUBiS program. On FUBiS.org, you can find all details. The regular course, Berlin and the Digital Music Era, is offered on-site in winter and summer. You can earn credits that may be counted towards your degree at your home institution. A main topic of the course, Berlin and the Digital Music Era, is the relationship between aesthetic trends and technological developments under the cultural and economic conditions in Berlin. We deal with the past and present of techno, electronic dance music, and experimental electronica. You will gain insight into the current conditions of production and consumption, as well as of performance and distribution of music. In particular, we will develop a critical understanding of the different discourses on digital and analog phenomena. This is very important because the two terms, analog and digital, which refer to each other, are often used differently, especially with regard to music. I would therefore like to explain this briefly. Sometimes digital is simply equated with software and analog with hardware. Digital often refers to all phenomena that are online or virtual. And analog would be everything you can touch with your hands. Such a widespread understanding of analog and digital is often linked to aesthetic or cultural judgments. For example, digital sounds are considered cool and analog sounds warm. As a basis for our course, I prefer a more precise definition of the terms in relation to the different types of digital and analog signal paths. Digital information is binary structured and is transmitted in zeros and ones, for instance. Analog information, on the other hand, has smooth transitions. In relation to music, for example, this leads to different types of errors. A defective CD or an online music stream stutters and skips, while a vinyl record hisses. Based on this fundamental distinction between digital and analog, we can discuss in particular the manifold hybrid phenomena of analog and digital that currently exist in the production, consumption, performance, and distribution of music. To speak of a digital era does not mean that everything is digital, but rather that the digital elements are formative. The perspective on technical aspects on the course is thus always linked to aesthetic, cultural, and social questions. Therefore, no special musical or technical knowledge is required. The interdisciplinary course is open to students of all disciplines. For the topic, Berlin and the Digital Music Era, excursions in the city are naturally very useful. We can visit software companies such as Ableton or Native Instruments, which emerged from the vibrant music scene in Berlin in the 1990s and are now among the world's leading providers of music software, such as digital audio workstations, synthesizers, and sample libraries. However, we will not be attending a pure product promotion event, but will have the opportunity to talk to representatives of the companies about topics that we discuss in the course, such as the phenomenon of laptop music and the trend of the return of hardware interface that has been going on for years. In addition to these big players, we will also visit smaller manufacturers of special music devices that have been launched by a younger generation in recent years, such as Coma Electronic. The conditions under which these creative projects work in Berlin are influenced not least by comprehensive urban developments, such as processes of gentrification. We will also visit galleries where sound art is exhibited, for example, installations with sound and noise generating objects. In this way, we can conduct an informed discussion about the blurring boundaries of music and media art based on practical experience. As a final example of our excursions, I would like to mention the Berlin Computer Game Museum. In the comprehensively sorted exhibition, games from different decades can be tested in practice. This excursion is related to our discussions on the increasingly important phenomenon of interactive sounds, which is particularly evident in video games. After this overview, I would now like to take a closer look at a special topic of the course, Berlin and the Digital Music Era. The title of today's lecture is More Than 4 to the Floor, Sequencers in Contemporary Electronic Music. And the following, I will deal in particular with these aspects. First of all, what is a sequencer anyway? What are its outstanding features? And in what way are sequencers shaping today's electronic music? To what extent does this always depend on the creative use of sequencers? To answer these questions, not only the technical features, but especially the user interfaces of hardware and software sequencers have to be considered. In this way, we can develop a critical understanding of sequencers, which helps us to classify the aesthetic discourses associated with them, for instance, on Maschinenmusik, music made with machines. Such discourses are particularly virulent in the field of techno music. So let's start there. What is a sequencer? Sequencers do not produce sounds, but tell the sound engines when and how to play. hence the name of a sequencer. It outputs a sequence, meaning a series of information that can be converted into audible sounds by a sound generator. This is why you cannot hear the sequencer itself, only the sounds that are triggered and controlled by a sequencer. Sequencers act like interactive scores or music generators. What does that mean? On the one hand, a sequencer resembles a score. Note values, rest, accentuations, and different sound properties can be entered in different ways to create a musical process, a sequence. But while a score written on paper is itself mute and must be interpreted in instrumental playing, a sequencer is directly connected to sound generators. So melody and rhythm values entered into the sequencer are directly audible through the connected sound generators, and they can be continuously changed at any time. The handling of sequencers can become much more complex if not only one sequencer is used, but several that influence each other. In this way, sequencers can be left to themselves to a certain extent and create multi-layered musical sequences, but which can be manually interfered with at any time. The use of sequencers is thus characterized by the relationship between automated processes and manual interventions. This relationship can take two extremes. Either a sequencer is left to itself, that is, as soon as an automated sequence has been started, it is no longer intervened in. Or the other extreme. If a sequence is running, it is permanently changed manually, for example, by manipulating values or changing the tempo. The nature of this mixture of automated sequences and manual intervention has a great influence on the music produced in the process. And that's why the history of sequencers is characterized by a close exchange between technicians who develop models and musicians and composers who work creatively with them and whose experiences are in turn incorporated into the design of new sequencer models. In the history of sequencers, there were many cases where musicians did something with the devices that was not intended by the designers. Musicians sometimes did not read the instructions and experimented with the devices. Or musicians deliberately took advantage of the technical malfunction of the devices. In this way, unexpected but musically interesting events occurred. Later, based on the experimental attempts of the musicians, technicians tried to construct features for new sequencer models. This intensive creative exchange between technical development and artistic musical use can be observed especially in Berlin. There's a close connection in Berlin between producers of electronic music and also companies that develop new versions of sequencers. There are almost countless different models of sequencers, both as standalone hardware and as software that runs on a computer or on a tablet or smartphone. For instance, sequencers are functional units of hardware drum machines or digital audio workstation software. Now, let's take a closer look at two examples. Our first example is a sequencer as a functional unit of a drum machine. On the surface of this drum machine, you can read its name, the TR-901 rhythm composer. This machine was produced by the Japanese company Roland in the early 1980s. It was the successor of the probably most famous drum machine of all times, the Roland TR-808. While the 808 was very popular in disco, house, and hip-hop, the 909 became legendary mainly because of its use in early techno from Detroit. The Berlin techno scene of the 90s was strongly influenced by this Detroit techno sound. So, in a way, both the sounds and the sequencing capabilities of this Japanese 909 drum machine, or rather the way Detroit artists handled it, have influenced the music scene in Berlin. The surface of the device can be divided into two areas, where the control elements of the sound generators and the sequencer are located. In the upper part are the rotary controls for changing the individual drum voices, such as volume and pitch of bass drum and snare. In the lower part, there's a knob for the tempo and a row of 16 buttons that allow rhythmic patterns to be entered for each drum part. This is the typical appearance of a so-called step sequencer, which nowadays can be found in many variations in software and hardware. This interface design allows an intuitive handling of the possibilities of sound generating and sequencing, a mixture of process automation and manual intervention. The advantages and disadvantages of such a simple step sequencer are obvious. Only 16 steps are truly a big limitation. In order to access further temporal steps, the view has to be changed. On the other hand, all 16 steps can be accessed at any time. For example, if the 16 steps are looped, that means played as a permanent repetition, any number of steps can be activated or deactivated at any time during the sequence, so that the musician at the drum machine can always change to the rhythm, even just before playing. Such a handling of the possibilities of automation and manual operation can lead to musically highly innovative rhythms. Our second example is a so-called digital audio workstation, a comprehensive music production software that resembles a virtual recording studio because it combines the functions of mixing consoles, sound generators, effects, and sequencers. Unfortunately, sometimes the entire digital audio workstation is referred to as a sequencer, but this wide use of terms is confusing. So let's stick with it. The sequencer is only one specific part of such music production software. Our example is a music production software with a programmatic name Live, which has been developed in Berlin by the company Ableton since the late 1990s. Also, the screen view of the software, of which we see a part here, can be divided into two areas. In the lower area, you can access the sound generators and effects. The sequencers is located in the upper section. Similar to modern software for word processing, layout, or video editing, there is a seemingly unmanageable number of detailed settings. Although the concept of Ableton is to limit the user interface to a few main windows, there are now many menus and submenus in the program. This shows the struggle with the basic dilemma of software. On the one hand, it should be clear and easily accessible. On the other hand, it should offer as many options as possible. Compared to the few knobs and switches of the hardware drum machine from the 1980s that we've looked at before, it seems obvious that this latest software offers much more extensive settings for both sound generation and sequencing. However, using the software only with mouse and keyboard is much less comfortable, fast, and intuitive than with the drum machine. For this reason, Ableton, like many other companies, has worked hard in recent years to develop a special hardware controller for their software. The controller from Ableton, which is designed to allow intuitive manual operation of the software, is called Push. The most striking part of the hardware controller is the large matrix of brightly colored push buttons. This matrix can be configured in various ways to control different settings of Ableton, especially the sequencer. However, the possibilities of this interface are limited or encourage specific uses. I'll come back to this later. So, after a brief look at two sequencer models, the question might be, what does music produced with sequencers sound like? But that question is a bit problematic because, well, let's say it again because it is so important. You cannot hear a sequencer itself, only the sounds that are triggered and controlled by a sequencer. But if we keep this in mind, we can of course consider what aspects are characteristic of the popular use of sequencers. With almost all sequencers, it is easily possible to repeat a rhythm or a melody permanently, in other words, to create loops. The time grid of most sequencers is given in units of 8, 16, 32, 64, and so forth. Remember the 909 drum machine, whose step sequencer has 16 buttons. Although on the 909 and most sequencers, such a 16-unit grid can be changed to create different rhythmic patterns, this standard 16-unit time grid is often used and can be considered characteristic of music produced by sequencers in a standardized way. The dominance of 8, 16, etc. time units is of course not an invention of machines, but rather the machines were constructed by humans on the basis of a specific cultural understanding of music in which these temporal grids dominate. So, if sequencers are used in a standardized way, the music produced with them is often dominated by uniform beats. But depending on the creative use of sequencers, very complex rhythmic overlays are also possible. The typical 4-to-the-floor rhythm of a dominant continuous bass drum is thus characteristic for a typical use of sequencers, but by far not the only possible. After all these words, let us now listen to an example of a popular use of sequencers in music production. It is the beginning of an online image film in which the soundtrack is characterized by a musical sequence that is continuously repeated in slight variations. Please pay attention to the music now.
So I got here to do an intensive program, and I know this is one of the best universities here in Germany.
I think it's great, it's hard, but that's also why I'm here.
This music serves a specific purpose here. It generates attention and suspense for the FUBiS program, and therefore sometimes has to fade into the background. Music for image films or similar purposes is very common these days. For their production, sequencers are especially well suited to effectively create popular and sufficiently varied music. To be honest, I don't know how exactly the soundtrack was produced. In theory, it could have been recorded by a synthesizer orchestra of musicians without any sequencer at all. But that seems very unlikely. It would be far too expensive, and there are no musical characteristics to indicate that. But even if this were the case, the orchestra would have recorded the music according to typical sequencer features. As I said at the beginning of the lecture, the complete FUBiS film can be found at fubis.org. Just before the end of this excerpt from the FUBiS film, photos from my course Berlin and the Digital Music Era were shown. Here you can see a hands-on workshop that I offer each time, where students can experiment and work with different types of sequencers and sound generators in order to deal with the complex phenomenon of sequencers in practice. Let us now turn to some fundamental aspects. I already spoke briefly about the importance of interface design when I introduced the Roland 909 drum machine and Ableton Live software. Ableton developed a special hardware controller called Push to allow intuitive manual operation of its live software. Adam Patrick Bell has taken a critical look at Push, which was published in a volume with contributions on media theory and musicology. Bell has investigated how not only the design of Push, but also the manuals and tutorials provided by Ableton have an impact on making music. In his closing remarks, Bell quotes Dennis DeSantis, the head of music learning for Ableton. Bell quotes the following sentence from DeSantis about the software Ableton Live. Since most users will never change their default software options, the seemingly small decisions made by developers may have a profound effect on the way users will experience the software every day. Bell then discusses to what extent this statement by DeSantis can also be applied to Push. Let's read this section. Hardware and software are distinct domains, but DeSantis' description of the tyranny of the default in software is equally applicable, if not more, to music hardware such as Push. While live users are explicitly encouraged to customize their workflows to combat presets, Push users are implicitly asked to accept the preset architecture and its associated affordances as they are. This is not an Ableton-specific phenomenon. Every instrument constrains. Singular designs inevitably privilege some users and alienate others. The case of Ableton Push serves to illustrate that when a company produces both the product and the pedagogy, it has a profound impact on the ways in which people make music. So it seems to be less a question of whether an instrument or interface locks the user into certain procedures. Rather, it is of interest which specific procedures and interface proposes to the user and which possibilities there are for the user to interact with the instrument beyond these ready-made paths or to experimentally test new ways of dealing with it. Here, too, The developers can then try to take greater account of such experiences of musicians when updating the instrument. The course Berlin and the Digital Music Era gave me and my student the opportunity to discuss this issue in detail with Dennis Desanis during a visit to Ableton. As I said at the beginning of the lecture, the excursions achieve a special quality if they can be linked to discussions already held in the course. After this reflection on the effects of a concrete interface design on music making, I would like to talk about the relationship between interface and user on a more abstract level. Especially in the context of techno music, aesthetic discourses are virulent, in which sequencers play an important role. Techno, as a name for a musical movement, was established in Europe, especially by the record compilation Techno, the new dance sound of Detroit, which was released in Great Britain in 1988. In the liner notes, the music journalist Stuart Cosgrove quoted a programmatic statement by Derek May, one of the Detroit techno musicians. The music is just like Detroit. A complete mistake. It's like George Clinton and Kraftwerk are stuck in an elevator with only a sequencer to keep them company. This fictional scenario was later very often taken up to characterize techno and is quoted in almost all treatises on techno. However, the influences of the musician George Clinton and the band Kraftwerk, as icons of Afro-futuristically exuberant electrofunk on the one hand, and German thoroughly organized robot pop on the other, are interpreted differently. Furthermore, the role of the sequencer, who plays a fictive mediating instance in the unplanned elevator session, is usually not sufficiently discussed. But what can be described using the fictional scenario is this. The music is created here in an open-ended situation in a mixture of experiment and control with the help of a sequencer which functions as a time event machine, so to speak. 10 years later, in 1998, the music critic Kotwo Eshun explains the manifold connections between Afrofuturism and techno and combined them with jazz, breakbeat, and electronica. His argumentation, his stories, and his special poetic language have since inspired artists and even scholars. In his book, More Brilliant Than the Sun, Adventures in Sonic Fiction, Eshun describes how some musicians have discovered post-human rhythmatics, as he calls it, when using the Roland drum machine. With Man Parrish, Cybertron, Hashim, Soulsonic Force, and Johnson Crew, the Roland 808 Rhythm Composer opens a new threshold, the programming of post-human rhythmatics. Eshun describes a scenario in which the musicians do not rationally operate the sequencers of the drum machines, but are physically affected by machine-generated and sometimes unpredictable complex time sequences. Eshun writes, "This humanly impossible time, this automatization of rhythm, which is rhythmatics, opens up the post-human multiplication of rhythm. The rhythm synthesizer's spastic pulses seize the body, rewiring the sensorium in a kinesthetic of shockcuts and stirrers, a voluptuous epilepsy." At this point, it would make little sense to discuss to what extent Eshun correctly describes the historical use of a Roland drum machine or not. Eschun rather interprets the creative process of certain musicians and gives it a special meaning in a poetic way. Eschun's text, which he calls sonic fiction himself, is relevant because of its influence. His perspective was taken up by many music journalists and pop critics in the years following the publication of the book, and has in many ways shaped a new perception of the possible relationship between electronic musical instruments and their users. So we see how not only interface design, manuals, and tutorials, but also popular aesthetic discourses can contribute to a specific attitude towards electronic musical instruments and thus shape musical developments. This brings me to the end of today's lecture. In conclusion, I would like to mention once again two simple questions that are often asked and two simple answers that should be understood as an invitation to take a closer look at the subject. Does music produced by sequencers not sound human but machine-made? And is sequencer music characterized by simple repetitive rhythm? Well, this depends on the creative use of the possibilities of specific sequencers, especially on the kind of manual interventions in automated processes. Therefore, the following applies. A wide variety of musical styles can be produced with sequencers. I have covered some aspects of today's lecture and publications that I would like to mention for those interested. Most of these texts are in German, but as you may already know, there are very good opportunities at FUBiS to learn German or to improve existing language skills. I am therefore very much looking forward to hopefully soon being able to welcome students from all over the world to the FUBiS program to discuss not only the topic of today's lecture, but also many other aspects of Berlin and the digital music era. If you are interested, there are many ways to contact us. I wish you all the best and maybe see you in Berlin.